Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 31st, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. Happy Halloween, everyone. All right, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to take just a moment to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I rely on the support of individuals just like you. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Joe Wilkinson, Leonard Prince, Pasquale Gelati, Patrick Flynn, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right. I am excited to dive into the show this week. We had the opportunity to speak with an evolutionary biologist and geneticist and author of the new book, A Voice in the Wilderness. A pioneering biologist explains how evolution can help us solve our biggest problems. His name is Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr. He was actually the first African-American individual in the United States, I think in the United States, to receive a doctorate degree in evolutionary biology. And he currently is working as the Associate Director for Precision Microbiome Engineering. This is a NSF, National Science Foundation funded engineering research center whose mission is to advance microbiome technologies by developing diagnostic tools and different engineering approaches to ultimately prevent the colonization of infectious agents and promote beneficial microorganisms within the built environment. He's also a professor of, I think, biological sciences, at the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. So we're going to learn a lot about evolution, why it matters, and what we've kind of learned about ourselves from it and how it's going to affect us in the future. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr. Well, Joseph, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Well, I appreciate you having me on the show, Cara.
I'm excited to talk about your new book, A Voice in the Wilderness. A pioneering biologist explains how evolution can help us solve our biggest problems. And so before we dive into the book, I'd love to know a little bit about your journey. So is it true that you are the first Black man to receive, or the first African-American person in general to receive a PhD in evolutionary biology?
Yes, but I will qualify that because there are other persons of African descent who worked on evolutionary problems before me. In fact, I just found out today that Ernst Everett Just, one of the greatest African-American biologists of the 20th century, near his death, wrote a piece on the evolution of morals. However, those other people were not actually trained as evolutionary biologists in the classical sense, and
Right.
the word evolutionary biology didn't appear on their PhD certificate, nor were they active in the primary scientific organization of evolutionary biologists, the Society for the Study of Evolution, which is an international society. And so I therefore claim that honor of being the first person of African descent to be officially an evolutionary biologist.
It's incredible. You know, I had a friend of mine who is also a respected professor on the show somewhat recently. I don't know. I've lost all track of time. It might have been like 2 years ago, but it feels recent. Named Shane Campbell Staton. And one of the things that we talked about, because he's in an evolutionary biology department and does ecology, was sort of the experience of being a Black man in these institutions where a lot of the names of different wings and different awards are for like eugenicists, and like just the experience of being in evolutionary biology, but knowing that the history of evolutionary biology is steeped in evolutionary genetics, which, I mean, up until a certain point in time, wasn't the journal of like I can't remember the name of the journal, but there's a journal, a genetics journal that used to be called the Journal of Eugenics.
Yeah, I would really take some umbrage with that overarching claim about the history of evolutionary biology. I think it's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I certainly demonstrate that in my first book, The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, which was published first in 2001. I think because most people don't know much about evolution, they tend to think about some of its most negative episodes.
Right.
For example, people have heard the term social Darwinism, but don't recognize that Charles Darwin not only had nothing to do with social Darwinism,
Mm-hmm.
but felt, that the originator of social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer, was basically an idiot and didn't understand the ideas of evolution at all. During the eugenics movement, which is another thing that people tend to focus on in the history of evolutionary biology, although
Yeah.
it's really also more the history of genetics. Although,
Right.
it's difficult to separate genetics and evolution, but they tend to focus on the eugenics movement as if it was a uniform thing with just
Mm-hmm.
fascists and Nazis, putting forward those ideas. And again, I discuss that history in detail in The Emperor's New Clothes.
Right.
But what
Didn't
they don't
eugenics really
know,
start here in the U.S.? Didn't we
um,
export it to Germany, like largely?
it wasn't just the U.S., but you're right. It was the so-called Western democracies
Right.
that
Right.
led the way. So you're talking about the UK and the United
Mm-hmm.
States. And German eugenicists were doing, what eugenicists did across the world. But I was going to say that there was a split in the genetics community over eugenics, and there were just
Mm-hmm.
as many prominent geneticists, evolutionary biologists who were fighting against eugenics as there were fighting for it. So, for example, the International Congress of Genetics, which was held in Edinburgh in 1939, the conference literally broke up over Nazi claims of race science, where people
Mm-hmm.
walked out on both sides saying, this is enough. And a few weeks later, the Nazis were invading Poland. So to, present that sort of really uninformed view of the history of evolutionary biology is just wrong.
Right.
Um, and so much of what we know about human biological variation on the positive side was developed by evolutionary biologists and people who are directly my lineal ancestors. So I think, bottom line is we need a more nuanced understanding of the science and the people involved and where they stood and what they did than just saying, well, yeah, evolutionary biologists were responsible for, eugenics and fascism. That's simply not
Oh,
true.
sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm not sure anybody's making like such a bold claim. It's more the issue is working within a department where there is a storied history. And again, I don't know what your specific university setting is like, but there are many evolutionary biology, ecology, genetics departments who still have awards. Wings of the building, rooms named after individuals who had pretty unsavory ideas.
No,
And
I completely agree with you there, Cara.
mhm,
Cara. But I would also say, since we're really talking about structural racism, the
right.
legacy of structural racism and white supremacy in America, that is true of every single discipline in the academy, whether it is
Absolutely.
English, whether it is chemistry, whether it's biology. The
Yeah,
bottom
yeah.
line is these institutions were built under a society, a culture in which white supremacy was hegemonic. And so down here in the South, many of the Research One historically white institutions still have Confederate statues on their
Mhm.
grounds, still have buildings named after Confederates. And so, yes. And again, I would say it's somewhat disingenuous to call out evolutionary biology as if it is
Mhm.
somehow different from the entire legacy of white supremacy in higher education.
I think you make such an excellent point, because the truth of the matter is, to perpetuate that system of power and oppression, whatever academic field was standing is going to use whatever tools at their disposal to do so. And it just so happens that, we look at like Angela Saini's books, we look at kind of the history of race, quote, science, really like pseudoscience.
Yeah, I
And
always use the term pseudoscience.
yeah, which I think is more appropriate. So we look at the history of race pseudoscience, and it's again scientists using the tool that they know, which is the scientific method, to try to prove white supremacy, the same way, as you pointed out, that a poet would do it, the same way that a historian would do it, the same way that anybody in any academic field who has a motivated reasoning and a bias to try and make those obviously unfounded arguments is going to try and found them within their discipline.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
So tell me, kind of putting that obviously to the side, I'm curious about your journey. Did you know that you wanted to study evolution from the start? Did you always know that you were into biology? Did you even know that you were into science when you were young?
So the first part of the book is literally entitled, as I'm trying to remember it myself, The Unexpected Path, in chapter 1. There was nothing in my conditions of my birth that would have predicted that I was going to become a scientist. You need to understand that my parents grew up under violent Jim Crow in the 1920s and 1930s. They were denied education based upon the dictates of Plessy versus Ferguson. So, when they met in New Jersey after World War II had completed, they made a commitment that their children were going to get the education that they were denied, again, by structural racism in the American South. So they made the point of living in Westfield, New Jersey, which had an excellent public school system. And they could have gotten a much nicer house in a nearby town, but they turned that down because they wanted their kids to be in the best public school system around. But when I entered that school system, it was again a time period in which the superiority of the white race was unquestioned, and so for those of us who weren't white, they had very low expectations for what we would become. And so I tell stories in the first part of the book of how the people in my elementary school just didn't know what to do with me. Because I was so bright that their assumption was that I was actually mentally retarded. Now, if you can imagine, right?
Wow,
how do you go from
the mental
a kid,
gymnastics of that? Yeah,
who's showing outstanding intellectual ability and think, oh yeah, he must be mentally retarded. Let's put him in. And I know we don't use that term in modern.
Right, but we did back then. That was
back then that was the term.
Yeah,
so they tried to put me in special education, and my mother, who is the great hero of my early life, she pitched a fit in that school. She was simply not going to allow that. And you have to understand, this is a woman who, during her day, worked cleaning the homes of wealthy white folks, and at night pulled a shift in a plastics factory. So it wasn't like all she had to do was sit around and figure, I can hang out at the school, be part of the PTA, and make sure that my kids get a great education. That wasn't her life.
Right.
But she knew how important that was, and she simply would not allow it. So because she wouldn't allow it, they kept me in regular education. And this is a story that I think your listeners will find amazing. So I'm in third grade. Sitting in the library, and I'm reading a college-level history book, The Crusades by Harold Lamb. And the other teachers had always assumed that I was just acting out. I was getting these big books, and I was opening them and reading them, while the other kids were still reading, Fun with Dick and Jane, because I was compensating for my lack of ability to read. So this particular day, a new student teacher had come on to our school, And she actually took the time to sit down next to me, and she asked me the question, "Little boy, what are you reading about?"
Hmm.
And then I proceeded to tell her all about the histories of the First, Second, and Third Crusades, and who the major players were, and why they were doing what they were doing, and so forth, and who my favorite persons in the narrative were. And she was like, "What the F?" And the next day, I ended up being transferred to the advanced learning group.
Oh, wow. So she really was kind of an important kind of, I don't
Yeah,
know, step in your
yeah, that was
process.
Deus ex machina.
Yeah.
You know, she plopped in, and she obviously, because again, she's a student teacher, she must have, had great courage to fight with the established teachers to get her point across to get me transferred. And so I don't remember the name of this young woman, but she definitely did me a turn. And much of what happened in my education going forward, it really be traced to that day. And they soon found that I was, a stellar math and science student. History was my first love, but I actually was much better at math and science.
Mm-hmm.
I had some outstanding high school biology teachers who, wanted to see me go to college. But again, we were so poor that, you know, the idea of going to college just wasn't on the table.
Right.
My
Okay.
father said to me, that he could get me an apprenticeship in the carpenters union because they made good money.
Hmm.
That was the altitude that my parents, could envision, because they didn't know anything about college. They didn't even know what you did with a college degree.
Right. Right. And so how did you make that leap then? I mean, how really were you able to find I mean, obviously the interest and the passion, I think these are things that come naturally, but they're also fostered, but holding on to it and not saying, okay, that's not for me. I guess I need to change courses. That's, that's a very personal journey.
Yeah, it was. And for me, again, I talk about it in the book. Your listeners, many of them are probably much younger than I am.
Mm-hmm.
Don't remember the civil rights movement because I was literally living this through the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
So, I had role models that I could see, people like Muhammad Ali, people like Bill Russell, people like Jim Brown. Okay. I looked up to these athletes because they weren't just athletes, they were social activists. I was reared on the sermons of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., but I
Mm-hmm.
also, listened to the sermons of Malcolm X. So there were a lot of things going on in this time period. And for someone who was living like I was, who was poor, working class, I was beginning to ask questions about why the world was this way. Why was there so much injustice?
Right.
When King was shot, when Malcolm was shot, when the Panthers were murdered in Chicago, these are all things that we talked about in my community at the same time that I was hanging out in classes with people from the other side of the tracks, literally from the other side of the tracks in my town, who had no idea that these things were impacting me and people with my, color of skin.
Mm-hmm.
But the double-edged sword of that was by hanging out with these people, I began to learn what the possibilities were. So probably the second biggest thing that changed my life was me taking up the game of chess again at an early age, but then becoming really good at it, so that by the time I was in high school, I was playing on the Westville High School chess team. I was playing with the YMCA club, the Westville Pawns, which was one of the strongest teams on the East Coast. And through my activities as a chess player, I had the opportunity to again interact with people whose parents were professionals. In fact, one of the most important ones that I discuss in the book was my interaction with the Bagley family. And they were a family in which the father was a European American and mother was a Chinese American. And one,
Mm-hmm.
I'd never seen that before
Mm-hmm.
because I'd never had any interactions with persons of Asian descent or with anyone who was a scientist. So interacting with that family gave me a vision of, what kind of lives scientists have. And so that became the main circle of my social life in high school. All of these people were the children of professionals and who were all going to go to Ivy League colleges. And so this is one of these places where, my road diverged from that of my African American, classmates, most of whom didn't go to college. So that was a watershed point in, what I ended up becoming.
Yeah. And so I'd love to know kind of more about that, that decision or maybe that path to dive in specifically to evolutionary biology. Like, what was it about this field that so kind of captured you?
Okay, so that happens later. So, I'm in college now.
Mm-hmm.
And, at that time, still, most biology departments didn't require evolution as a course in the biology major. And
Okay.
I was at an elite liberal arts college, Oberlin, and they didn't require evolution, but they did have a visiting professor teach evolution. And so I signed up for this class. And one of the things you have to know about Oberlin in the community of evolutionary biologists is that we produced in my class, and in those couple of years of my class at Oberlin, we produced a disproportionate number of evolutionary biologists who then went on to be members of the National Academy of Sciences.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah,
Why do you
about
think that is?
six of them, because we were just that good.
Right.
Um, and one of those people is my colleague, Richard Lenski.
Okay.
And Richard is known, by the moniker "the man who bottled evolution." He's been on the Discovery Channel and so forth. Richard's experiments, in fact, I nominated him for, a lifelong achievements in evolutionary biology in the SSE, Society for the Study of Evolution, last year, and he won that award.
Mm-hmm.
But we were all classmates together in that class at Oberlin. And honestly, Richard and I were the two who had the most dialogue and seemed to understand the subject better than all the other people in the class.
Mm-hmm.
So I was interested in that, but I wasn't still ready to choose it as a discipline. The next class I did really well in as an undergraduate was in microbiology. And again, this was because it had a really good professor. But when I graduated from Oberlin, I was not someone that anybody was recruiting for graduate school, in part because my grade point average was so low. I only
Okay.
had a 2.7 grade point average
Okay.
coming out of college. People like Richard, everybody was trying to get them, right? So they were all being given big fellowships to go to big schools.
Mm-hmm.
But me, okay, I was lucky to get a graduate assistantship at the University of Lowell, which is now UMass Lowell, but back then University of Lowell. I was absolutely lucky to get a graduate assistantship to that school because
Mm-hmm.
nobody was looking for me. And my life really changed. And again, by this time, I'm more of an ecologist than an evolutionary biologist. But when I got to graduate school, all the things which had been weaknesses for me as an undergraduate became strengths.
Okay.
And the other thing, which, even though this show is called Talk Nerdy, I was never a nerd in the sort of negative sense of the
Right.
word.
Right.
I mean, in college, I was a four-sport athlete. I was captain of the volleyball team. I was training for, athletic competition all year long. And that was really taking a lot of time away from studying.
Mm-hmm.
So when I went to graduate school, I wasn't doing that anymore. So, in conjunction with the fact that graduate school is really about research and how one designs experiments and so forth, all the things that were holding me back as an undergraduate were gone. And in
Mm-hmm.
graduate school, I excelled. I went from 2.7 to 4.3 on a 4 scale. And I yet still wasn't an evolutionary biologist, even when I went to Michigan for my PhD, to start my PhD. I was still a community ecologist.
Okay.
But again, when you read the book, Michigan, again, is a watershed moment for me in my life, because that is where I began to understand that biology was, in fact, a social weapon. I really hadn't understood that before. And in addition, because I hadn't understood that, all of my shortcomings in my previous educational experience were things that I internalized and I thought were the result of my lack of ability, my incapacity. I really did not understand the way structural racism brought about the condition that we now call today imposter syndrome. I didn't understand that until I went to Michigan, and I particularly met John Vandermeer, who is still a professor there. And it was one of these things where a light switched on in my head, and now all the stuff that had been darkness became clear. But again, that's another part of the story. You're still asking me how I ended up in evolution, because I left Michigan. Okay. I basically flunked out, stopped going to classes, in
Okay.
part because of imposter syndrome, in part because of becoming politically active against structural racism
Mm-hmm.
at that university. And it led me basically to flunking out of school. And so I spent, another 2 years doing labor organizing and community activity in Detroit before I decided to go back to graduate school to pursue a degree. And then evolutionary biology just turned out to be blind, dumb luck.
Okay.
I walked into the graduate office. I told the graduate officer I'd like to come back and finish my PhD here. And it was Bill Moore, who was a professor in the biology department. And he looked at me and said, "Well, you do know that this is a very prestigious institution." And my response to him, "Yes, Professor Moore, that's why I want to come here to
Right.
finish my PhD." And then I handed him my, CV. He opens it up, takes one look at it, sees where I did my undergraduate degree, picks up the phone, calls Professor Leo Luckenbill in the department, says, "Leo, I got a kid here, you're going to want to talk to." And Leo was working on an evolutionary problem, and that's how I became an evolutionary biologist.
So what was the problem that he was working on that you ended up kind of joining?
One of the greatest problems, the greatest victories of evolutionary theory in the 20th century. And that
Tell
is the
me about it.
question of why organisms age.
Ah, such an important question and linked to so many things.
In fact, Peter Medawar in 1952 wrote a very famous book called An Unsolved Problem in Biology,
Hmm.
because all sorts of crazy theories were being presented, even in the mid 1980s, about why organisms age.
Ooh, like what? What were some of the things that we now
Well,
obviously know are
the
debunked?
most common theories are the sort of wear and tear theories. Is that
Mm-hmm.
organisms, and of course, you would understand that the logic of this is circular. So it's basically people saying, well, yeah, the parts of organisms wear out over time,
Right.
and that's why they die. But that's really an observation of senescence or an observation of aging. That's not answering the question why they age.
Right. It's sort of
Um,
the result, not the
that's the
cause.
result of the
Yeah.
process, yes.
Yeah.
But that was one of the predominant scientific theories of the time,
Mm.
and amongst some, biologists who still study aging, that's pretty much what their theories boil down to. And that's in 2022.
Right.
So other ideas, or the sort of group selectionist ideas, which is, organisms age so that they can give way to younger organisms so that they can reproduce. And so the old organisms aren't using up the resources for the young organisms.
Hmm.
And in that regard, yesterday I was reading The Funnies, like I do every morning. And I think it was Dale and Ernest, or one of the comics that I normally read. Argyle Sweater, I think that was one. And they have a cartoon of Darwinian airlines. And the announcer is saying that the plane is about to crash. And it recommends to the passengers that they move to the exits, pushing all the old and enfeebled persons out of the way, and the caption was Darwinian Airlines.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the idea of, you get rid of the old so that the young can reproduce. That's also equally wrong.
Right. But that's, again, I feel like that's also looking at, it's like a hindsight bias. Like
Yeah,
you're looking at the
again,
result.
it's a result, not a theory.
Right, right.
So I was amongst the biologists who demonstrated that the theory, which was worked out by, a series of great evolutionary theorists in the 20th century, beginning with George C. Williams, and then William D. Hamilton. And by the way, Hamilton was one of my professors at Michigan.
Mm.
I wasn't in his research group, but I knew him pretty well. We talked all the time. And they demonstrated that the sole sufficient cause of aging in multicellular organisms results from the declining ability of natural selection to eliminate genes whose age-specific effects are bad after an organism's net expected future reproduction is zero.
Mm-hmm.
And so this leads to the accumulation of genes in the genomes of such organisms, including ours, of genes which turn on after that point in time that cause progressive molecular physiological dysregulation, which eventually leads to death. But those things don't happen during development and during the active reproduction of the organism.
And so is this why we see things like, the quote unquote immortal jellyfish or the hydra or whatever? These
That's
organisms, they can potentially live forever because they keep reverting back to this like juvenile or I guess
because they
reproductive
reproduce
state.
by binary fission.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no separation, therefore, between their germ line and their somatic line. The somatic line being the cells that do all the work. So,
Right.
like, the ectoderm, the mesoderm, the endoderm, the, muscles, nerves, those kinds of things. And the germ line, which are the cells which produce the gametes. When they divide by binary fission, there's no separation between the somatic line and the germ line. And therefore, natural selection doesn't act against the soma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they essentially can reproduce by binary fission for essentially as long as they don't get eaten or killed.
Right. They die by like quote natural causes,
Yeah.
or I guess in the
External,
wild.
what we call external causes.
Yeah.
So, but in organisms where that separation doesn't occur, the best way for folks to understand this is that a chicken is simply an egg's way of making another egg.
Mm.
So it's the germline that goes on, and the somatic tissue that eventually dies. And that's what natural selection has produced for all multicellular organisms that reproduce that way on our planet. And the implications of this are massive when you think about it. So, for example, I tell my students that every person in this room is carrying genes that originated in the last universal common ancestor of all living things. The organism we call Luca, which was a volcanic vent bacterium some 3.5 billion years ago.
Oh, I didn't know there was like a common name or
it's called
nickname.
last universal common ancestor, Luca.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and so Luca passed down genes to other bacterial-like things until you get eukaryotic-like things that have more complicated cells, until you get multicellular type things, until you get vertebrate type things, until you get those that walk on land, and then we get mammals, and then we get primates, and then we get people. Mm-hmm. So we could trace those genes all the way back to the first living thing on the planet.
Yeah.
And that's because the germline goes on and is immortal unless that lineage goes extinct.
And of course, there are so many branches that did ultimately go extinct, but we're counting backward from us, which means that there is immortality there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And, at some point soon, we probably will go extinct.
Right. But we can literally look at our own DNA, at our own genome, and find all of that.
Yes.
Yeah. So cool. I mean, it really is like existential when you think about it.
Yeah, it is.
It's a
It
lot
is
deeper
totally
than it seems.
existential.
Right, right. Wow. And this is your work. This is your legacy. How
Yeah.
so
Go ahead.
I'm just curious how it I don't know. It's like I don't want to stay linear. We don't have to stay linear or chronological, but I'm curious about how this really important question that you worked on, in the past, I should say worked, past tense, because now this is commonly accepted knowledge. But
Actually, it's not commonly accepted.
really, so there are still people who really kind of fight against this within the field.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is what we call gerontology
Mhm.
is still a mess. Gerontology is the study of aging.
Right.
There are literally, I'd say, a handful of people who really understand aging on this planet.
Hmm.
And then there's a bunch of hacks. I'm not, so I don't know if they're going to listen to the show, but there are a bunch of hacks out there who have all sorts of crazy ideas that really just don't hold up.
It's just funny because I come from psychology, like clinical psychology, and I like literally work in a gerontology clinic. But of course, what we do in doing psychological treatment for an aging population is not about why our cells age. It's about
Yeah.
how to psychologically handle, all of the pressures of aging. So
Yeah.
it's just funny that you said that. It made me giggle a
Yeah,
little
but
bit.
again, when I'm talking about these hacks, I'm talking about people who do work on
Right.
the cellular, molecular,
Mhm.
genetic mechanisms of aging, and there are a lot of people they just don't get it, and that's in
Interesting.
part because they don't understand evolution. And by the way, this is a major problem that permeates biomedical research
Mm.
across the board, and works into clinical practice,
So they
which
almost
is
see evolution as
yeah,
like something, oh, that's separate. That's for the evolutionist. I'm just focusing on exactly what's happening at the molecular level in the cell. I don't need to know evolution. Like I'm curious what their internal dialogue is, that they don't think that
it's
those things are so linked.
Yeah, it's part of, and I've brought many of the faculty in my own department who are trained in the molecular paradigm to the light, and
Hmm.
it's literally like Paul in Tarsus when the scales fell from his eyes and
Hmm.
finally could see Jesus.
Hmm.
I mean, that's how they feel like. I mean, they have been mistrained their entire career, and
Interesting. And
once yeah,
it just
go ahead.
wasn't part of the training. Like it was like just a blind spot, or was it that they were like, like, I don't know, that's not the right
It's
word, but
generally not part of
anti-trained.
it's not part of their training, but it's also
Hmm.
what you just said, an anti-training
Mm.
in a way of looking at biology that is reductionist,
Hmm.
thinking that everything starts at the level of the molecule or the
Right.
enzyme without understanding how those molecules and enzymes came into existence. And I give you a really good example of that. So they gave the Nobel Prize for the discovery of CRISPR-Cas9 to Carpentier, and I forgot the name of the other woman. It's Dudier or Carpentier a couple of years ago. So CRISPR-Cas9, is a really important thing because it now provides the opportunity to be able to, edit genomes. But that system came about as it evolved as a means of protecting bacteria from bacteriophages, the viruses that attack bacteria. So while, knowing that doesn't help you turn CRISPR-Cas9 into a gene editing system, we wouldn't have CRISPR-Cas9 if bacteria hadn't had to evolve a means of protecting themselves from bacteriophage.
Right. Right.
So one of the things that I focus again on training my students is understanding the difference between what are called ultimate explanations
Mm.
and proximate explanations.
Mhm. Mhm.
So Thaddeus Dobzhansky, the Russian-born geneticist, who's also one of my lineal ancestors, said nothing in biology makes sense save in the light of evolution. And he wrote a brilliant essay on that in the American Biology Teacher in 1973. He gave numerous examples of the things that you can now understand if you apply an evolutionary lens upon them, which is literally everything in biology. And then proximate explanations are, okay, now that we understand that, how does this thing work? And we can work, at the cellular level, can work at the molecular level and demonstrate how these particular mechanisms operate.
Right,
But
mechanism. I was about to say, it's like
yeah,
you
they
can
are
get mechanistic
mechanisms.
with it for sure, but you
Yeah,
need to understand this kind of
the
this
why question.
scaffolding. Yeah, it's so funny. I'm seeing a parallel in my head with the work that I do, and again in clinical psych, and I'm existentially oriented as a psychologist, and I see this orientation as sort of like it's hard to understand human behavior, human affect, human anything without understanding our existential state. Yet cognitive behavioral theories, all of these beautiful things that are really evidence-based work and they're lovely, but they're so mechanistic. And I feel like they miss a foundational explanation. They miss something that is needed to understand the gestalt of it all. And it's funny because that quote that you said, like nothing is understood except in light of evolution. It reminds me of when Sagan said, the beauty of a living thing is not the how did he word it? The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that it's made of, but the way those atoms were put together. Like, it's not the parts, it's how the parts change over time and how those parts came to be that tells you so much about why the parts do what they do.
Yeah, and the other thing is, how do you learn, how the system works? Is you work by working down from grand unifying ideas through all of the various levels to the particular phenomenon. So it's the old saying of seeing the forest and recognizing that the forest is composed of individual trees.
Right. And we can do
But
work on the trees, but we
right,
can't get so lost on the tree that we forget the forest
right.
exists.
And
Yeah.
in fact, you can't work backwards. You
Right.
can't work backwards from understanding the function of a individual tree to then work out the function of the forest. It doesn't work. So one way works and the other one gets you lost.
Right. So it's
And
this
that's
top
what
down versus bottom up
Yeah,
sort of. Yeah.
that's what
Yeah.
evolutionary biology provides biology. It's its core unifying theory. In the same way in physics, you have, unification theory as being the core, unifying idea that makes everything else in physics work.
Mm-hmm. And so when we're thinking about evolution, clearly evolution as a discipline, as a practice, I shouldn't say practice, but a method, it has all this really brilliant and beautiful explanatory value. And just like you said, as when we understand or when we try to study things in light of or within the context of an evolutionary frame, it's really illuminating. And that is, of course, when we look at what is or what was. But I'm super curious, and this might be kind of a vague question. Questions about what will be. Like, what can evolutionary biology, how can evolutionary biology help us as we think about our future, as we think about sort of where we are going? And when I say we, I mean that as a global sort of life, not necessarily human beings.
Okay, so let's take global life, and then
Mm-hmm.
after I talk about that, we'll talk about human beings.
Right. Okay.
So, what evolution tells us in sort of broad strokes is that complex organisms like ourselves are rare accidents in the history of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at, large bodied, organisms, their lifetime across the fossil record is only about 1,000,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you put that in context, life on this planet has existed for 3.5 billion years. Now, we know what's been here that entire 3.5 billion years? Bacteria and viruses.
Okay. Yeah.
So those simple self-replicating systems are never going to go anywhere. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
long as there is a planet, we're going to have bacterial life forms. We're going to have things that attack cellular life forms in the form of viruses.
And isn't there, like, just in sheer numbers, like it's kind of astounding when you actually look at the numbers of, like, for every one, I don't know, fish, or for every one, insect, there are X number of these bacteria or viruses, these like microorganisms that either live in it, live on it, live in proximity to it. It's like mind-boggling,
Yeah,
the
it's
number of these
mind-boggling.
things.
I'll give you how mind-boggling it is. So we think that there are at least 1 billion bacterial species on the planet. Okay. And of the 1 billion bacterial species on the planet, each one of them has at least 2 different types of bacteriophages, that is, viruses that infect bacteria.
Oh, jeez.
So, during the height of the SARS-CoV epidemic, when I was working to help get people in my own family to get vaccinated,
Right. Yeah.
I worked out back of the napkin calculation to demonstrate to them that new and more dangerous variants would certainly evolve if this pandemic was unchecked. And I
Right.
calculated that on one day, based upon the known viral load of an individual SARS-CoV-2 patient, that in the United States, and this was during 2020, that there were more SARS-CoV-2 viral particles in the United States than there were stars in the known universe.
Yeah. Oh, that's
And that number
bananas.
of stars in the known universe is 10 to the 24th power.
Yeah, which is
And
like an
SARS-CoV-2
incomprehensible number.
particles was like 3 times more than that.
Right. When we're using scientific notation, like we're talking, 24 zeros, 23 zero. Like we
Yeah.
can't even fathom numbers that big.
Yeah. But see, that also guarantees that the virus, particularly with that number of people infected, is going to continue to find better ways to infect people.
For sure.
So the alpha variant gave rise to the beta variant, which gave rise to the delta variant, which gave rise to the omicrons that we're dealing with now. But the good news, and it's one of the things that I hoped would happen, is that these omicron variants, while more transmissible, are less virulent.
Right. Yeah. Because
But
that's how
I
it's going to
also want to
survive.
warn people, Cara, that we shouldn't get too complacent on this, because in 1917, when the H1N1 influenza, called the Spanish flu, even though it started in America, not Spain, when that first started making people sick, its killing profile was very much like what we have in SARS-CoV-2 today, which is the very young and the very old. But by 1919, the virus had evolved the ability to kill across all age groups. And that's where it led to possibly over 100 million deaths worldwide. So we should not simply think that because Omicron today is less virulent, meaning makes people less sick and is more transmissible, that it can't re-evolve the capacity to make people really sick. So if you're not vaccinated, you really need to get vaccinated.
And what a beautiful example of, the idea that I think very often, and we even spent quite a bit of time, which was foundational and necessary, talking about evolution and evolutionary biology, in the context of its explanatory value, in the context of sort of how we became who we are, and how most of our understanding of biology is colored. But of course, we can point to these very specific examples that they have teeth. They feel very tangible to people's everyday lives and a little bit less esoteric. Not that the other examples are, because I don't think they're esoteric at all. But to somebody who's like, I don't want to theorize about this stuff. I don't want to get philosophical. I want to know why it matters that we understand this stuff. I mean, what a beautiful example. If we didn't understand evolutionary biology, we would not understand how these viruses evolve. We just wouldn't.
Yes. Yeah, we wouldn't, and we'd be completely unprepared to be able to deal with them. And I give you another big example, which is not an everyday thing, but it's a guarantee that it will eventually happen. So one of the things we learned from evolutionary science and the fossil record was the asteroid that destroyed the dinosaurs some 71 million years ago. Now, at that time, the dinosaurs were doing fine. They were all over the planet. They were in high numbers. They were in every habitat. If the dinosaurs had not gone extinct, highly unlikely that the small mammals that lived in the dinosaur world would have ever become the dominant large-bodied animals on this planet, and there would have never been any humans. So that asteroid took out the dinosaurs in a relatively short period of time. Well, because we know that now, NASA is looking at near-Earth objects. And, there's one, I forgot the name of this asteroid that has an elliptical orbit that it, goes from the asteroid belt to the sun and back around. And just yesterday, they found that this asteroid is doing things that other asteroids don't seem to do, which
Right.
is
Yeah.
its spin rate is picking up, which means that its trajectory may change. And so even though, when we say close to the Earth, it's still like half of the distance from the sun to Mercury, which is 6 million miles. But in, cosmic scale, that's really close.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's entirely possible that over the centuries, it can hit. And we know that, based on the fossil record, we get one of these mass extinctions about every 100 million years. So while you and I probably don't have to worry about the next mass extinction event, okay, knowing this could allow the human species to do what no other species did before us, which is prevent its extinction because of its understanding of the question and the technology.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's incredible to think about the fact that we as a species have all of this information and all of this potential information, right? Because there are obviously big questions that we're still actively working on investigating within the sciences, and have sort of the tools at our disposal, or we're actively inventing the tools to be able to interrogate and investigate. To be able to answer big questions like this, and actually develop technologies and develop kind of processes to, as you said, potentially prevent our own extinction. Yet at the same time, we're people. And as people, we work within government structures and political structures and different, systems. And we seem to be actively trying to accelerate our own extinction. On the other hand,
Yeah,
it's
I
such
was
a
going to flip that coin
yeah.
because I predicted in this book, Voice in the
Mm-hmm.
Wilderness, in the final chapter called The Evolutionary Science of Social Justice, that our only chance to survive as a species is to aggressively deal with injustice, meaning unless we find a way to become just societies, which we are not now and we've never been, we guarantee our own extinction.
Okay, so I agree 100%. And I want to really dig deep now into sort of the mechanism by which you mean that this is the case. Like, I really want to be clear here. Why
So
is it that we
we can
need
start
this?
off with unintended things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, yeah, while there are all sorts of lunatics who argue that anthropogenic climate change isn't real, I
Right,
say those people are lunatics. The
right. We'll put
data,
them on the
the
shelf.
evidence is really clear.
Yeah.
Human activity is causing climate change. And what we're seeing with regard to that climate change is more powerful storms, more powerful hurricanes, and more of them, more powerful tornadoes in the various tornado alleys in North America. And those things, are causing tremendous damage. Okay, we're not at the point where they're causing tremendous loss of human life, but they certainly can. I mean, look at what happened to crops in Florida as a result of the last major hurricane. So, climate change could dramatically shift our ability to grow food to feed people. It is already shifting the range of vector insects that carry very dangerous viruses, such as Zika virus, and others, such as Ebola. So, if we don't deal with climate change, we are creating conditions that could lead to our unintentional loss of, hundreds of millions of people around the globe and possibly our total extinction. Now, you could ask, well, how does social justice play into this? Because it comes down to who gets to make the decisions on, what our energy policy is. And if everyone's not capable of being heard and listened to, then we have a history of those who own, major corporations like the oil industry deciding what our energy agenda is going to be.
Right. And
And there's,
that's an extreme example, but a
yeah,
really obvious one. And then of
yeah,
course you have the situation that if people in the room who are like, I feel like it's the definition of privilege. Like privilege is not having to have thought about things because they don't affect you. And so if all the people in the room are only the privileged class, individuals who actively have awareness of unjust outcomes, their voices aren't in the room. There will be a perpetual dumping on the groups of people who are oppressed. It'll just
Yeah.
keep
That
perpetuating.
will keep happening. A really good example of that, again, going back to weather, was what happened with Hurricane Katrina.
Oh yeah.
And,
Oof.
one of the things that, really, illustrated that people who were haves were making the plans for major hurricanes is that the evacuation plans for the city of New Orleans all were prefaced on you owning an automobile.
Right.
If you didn't have an automobile, you didn't have a way to get out of the city. And the people who were left behind, suffered immeasurably, including, hundreds of deaths that could have been prevented. So that's, sort of a mild, and I hate to call that mild, example of how injustice continues to lead to, differential suffering and death. But it occurs in every aspect of people's everyday lives. Where you live, whether you have access to a job, to a living wage, all of those things play into your chances of survival and health span across your life. And the majority of people on the planet don't have that. And we look at the United States, we're seeing a growing gap between those that have it and those that don't. And those kinds of things, especially since one of the things we learned in neuroscience is the human brain does not respond well to being subordinated.
No.
And that
Yeah. It is
creates,
not. It is not psychologically healthy. That's
yeah,
true.
that creates social instability.
Yeah.
Social instability can lead to things like civil wars. Civil
Hmm.
wars can lead to global wars. So one of the things that's worrying me the most right now, and I'm sure, Cara, you're on the same page, is this invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, led
Hmm.
by the despot Vladimir Putin.
Hmm.
That is the kind of thing that could easily lead to a wider confrontation in Europe. And a wider confrontation in Europe could mean the use of nuclear weapons.
For
And
sure.
if nuclear weapons are used, the United States is definitely going to get involved. And
Hmm.
we could easily go from, what is an unjust and terrible situation in the Ukraine right now, but it's limited in terms of the damage it's doing, to something that takes out the entire human species.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's why, again, I argue in that chapter that we have to understand that every problem we are facing today starts and ends with our perspective of social justice.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's. I mean, I really appreciate the lack of shyness. And I mean, clearly, obviously, this matters to you, but it matters to the world. But I want to see more people within fields that aren't necessarily political science or history or sociology fields speaking up about the intersection of social justice and their particular field, especially within what we think of as the quote hard sciences, the STEM fields, right? Technology, engineering, math, coding, computer science, physics. These things, you can't decouple them. And I think for so often within the sciences, people have sort of run scared and said, that's not our purview. That's not my place. Science is somehow pure. Science is somehow not touched by these social issues, which is just not true. It's just not true. Science is done by people.
Yeah, I was going to say, Cara, that's not only is it not true, it's absolutely nonsense.
Yes,
Okay,
but so
so,
many people claim it.
and you can claim that when you are essentially privileged.
Right, right.
You can claim that when you're privileged. You can say, oh, yeah, that has nothing to do, my science has nothing to do with the world. Here's a really funny example. So I was a senior at Oberlin College, and I had a good friend. His name was Art. And Art worked on physics, and he worked on the physics of nuclear weapons. And I said to him, I said, Art, how can you do this? You understand that the only time these things will ever be used will probably mean the end of our species on this planet. And he said, well, Joe, what would you prefer, that people who aren't as good as me are working on these problems? I said, yes, Art, I do. Because if they weren't as good as you, the damn things wouldn't work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, let's try not to actually assure that this, yeah. Wow.
So at the end of the day, there's a difference between the scientific method, which is a means to objectively understand how nature works, how the
Mhm.
universe works, and the scientific enterprise, which is so
Right.
far away from objective, it really can't even use that word and scientific enterprise in the same sentence. Because the scientific enterprise has always been about empowering social elites. And it has done so throughout its entire history in the Western world. I mean, for example, the ability of somebody like Columbus to navigate to the Western world was possible because of astronomy. So without that knowledge, you don't have Vasco da Gama, you don't have Columbus, you don't have the expansion of colonial empires across people who had, never known that Europe existed. So every aspect of what scientists do, and is particularly well illustrated during periods of social upheaval, such as major wars. World War II, there was massive scientific developments that were directly related to winning or losing the war. Okay, and so forth. Vietnam War in the same way, development of napalm, which actually occurred during World War II, but was perfected in many ways by what happened in Vietnam. So science has always been associated with the social political fabric of the societies that conduct it.
Agree.
So
Yeah.
the
And
idea, that's just an insanely nonsensical idea that you can only state if you have privilege,
it,
which I didn't have.
100%. Yeah. It's so, this is the cheesiest example of that, but like, I've been on some dating apps. I'm living in Florida. I'm living outside of my normal. I usually live in LA, but I'm here for an internship. And it's, I'm on the dating apps and I'm looking, and some of them list things like whatever, your religion and your politics and your whatever. And one of the options on some of these apps is apolitical. And I'm like, only privileged people can choose apolitical. Like, what does that even mean? Like, you have no vested interest in your own self-interest and well-being and the well-being of like your all of the other people on the planet. Like, how it's just bananas to me when people, oh yeah, I don't deal in politics. I'm like, well, you must have lead a charmed life.
Yeah,
Like, it's
that's
just
such an
crazy.
impossibly ridiculous statement to make.
I
It's sort of like if I throw my pen in the air, it's going to keep hovering in the air because,
know.
after all,
Right?
gravity doesn't exist. I'm a gravity. Yeah, that's it. Totally a gravity.
What even anyway? So listen, I could keep you for hours and hours. I can't do that because we've already run over, but I was hoping that at the very end, I usually end my episodes by asking my guests the same two questions because I'm just, at this point, we're, 400 some odd episodes in. And I'm just always so fascinated by people's answers to these. We may have touched on it because we kind of went there together, but maybe you have a different answer. And these are sort of big picture. So are you ready for me to throw them at you?
Hey, bring it.
Okay, so I want you to think about the future, and that can really be in whatever context feels relevant to you. So we could be talking about the future of like you personally, your family, your culture, your society, or it could be like bigger, the globally, I don't know, cosmically. The first thing I want to know is what is keeping you up the most at night? The thing that you're legitimately concerned about, maybe you're feeling pessimistic, borderline cynical about, what are you really truly worried about? And then on the flip side of that, so we can, bring some positivity back, where are you finding your hope, your optimism? What are you kind of genuinely looking forward to?
Okay, so one of the things I will tell your listeners, because I don't know that this came out in our conversation at all,
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually a person of faith. I'm
Mm-hmm.
a confirmed Episcopalian.
Okay.
I believe in God.
Okay.
And so for that reason, I don't worry. I don't
Interesting.
worry because I believe that when I die, there's an afterlife for me.
Okay.
So I don't worry. But I do think about, and I am concerned about the lives of people who are living on this planet in, as I have pointed out, and throughout this talk, in woefully unjust situations. And right now, we're at one of these watershed moments in which I could go back in time and say, what did the geneticists who were at that 1939 conference I told you about, what were they concerned about? They were concerned about the spread of fascism in Europe. And they were right. And as a result of that, 20 million Europeans died, possibly the same number of people in Asia died. I'm concerned about the spread of fascism in the United States.
Hear, hear.
So right now, we've had an assault upon what I call the thin veneer of democracy that remains in this country on January 6th of 2022, when there was an insurrection where Trump-inspired fascists attempted to stop the legal transfer of power in this country. The fact that neither political party, the main political party, Democrats or Republicans, is doing enough to bring the individuals involved in this insurrection to justice, including the person that authored it, former President Donald Trump. That's one of the things I'm concerned about. And this is showing up in all sorts of ways with regard to the coming midterm elections, in which across the nation, these not just former Confederate states, but those that are, deeply mired in white supremacist thinking are attempting to disqualify voters of color across the nation. So that's one of the things that I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
So the second
100%.
question.
So where are you finding your optimism, especially against the background of these crises, these like democratic crises?
My optimism is the same optimism that I started the last question with.
Right.
Okay? I believe that God helps those who help themselves. And so we have an opportunity now, to stand up against this injustice. And I do believe that there are enough good people in this country so that we can stand up and we can make a difference. But I will say that the time for doing that is rapidly coming to a close. So we will be remembered, if there are future generations, by what we do in the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And hopefully we can make good decisions, just decisions, and decisions that really are mindful of all of us, because I truly believe, and it sounds like we're on the same page with this, that we are only as strong as the weakest among us. And really, we have to always think about those who need the most help and those who are struggling the most, and how we can have a just society for all, not just for those who were born lucky.
Thank you.
Listen, it has been such an illuminating chat. We've covered so many different topics. I feel like we had the opportunity to dive deep into so many things that really truly matter. And I just want to thank you for, obviously, the luminous career of dedication to this important field, but also for taking the time to author this book, to share these important insights with the world, and to take that hour with us today here on the show. Thank you so much, Dr. Graves. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Cara, for having me.
Of course. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.